Another big thing that really hits you after living in China, I don't think anyone can miss it, is that it just does not feel at all like a communist country. I've been to Cuba and it's a completely different feeling. Cuba feels poor, but China does not. It feels rich and highly capitalistic, more so than Canada, I would say. Actually, I used to joke with my assistant saying we were more communist than China and Canada because we had socialized medicine, which China does not have, or it has very limited coverage, I believe. But yeah, so, and especially when you see the wealth, there's just and there's extremes, big extremes. So this, for instance, this was the first Lamborghini dealership I'd ever seen in my life. And I grew up in and around Toronto. There might be a dealership somewhere here, but I haven't seen it. And so to see my first Lamborghini dealership in a communist country was pretty jarring. So I'll just read what I wrote here. Never imagined I'd see my first Lamborghini dealership in a second tier, less developed city in communist China. So what China's done is put cities in different tiers. And there's the first tier, the second tier, and I don't know how high it goes, but I think it goes quite high. So the whole idea is the first tier cities were designed to develop first, and they're allowed to have sort of the biggest multinational companies. So, Beijing would be an example, Shanghai, Guangzhou, which is in the south, would all be examples of that. And then there were second tier cities. So Jinan was actually a second tier city. So it wasn't designed to have the top multinationals, maybe the next tier down in terms of size. And my understanding at this point, 8 years later, is that the first tier cities are largely developed. And now the focus of development is occurring on, I think, still on the second tier cities. And I believe there's third, fourth, and fifth tier, and so on. So the second tier cities are growing much faster. And I know Nanjing, I remember seeing some kind of statistics say it was predicted to be in the top 10 fastest growing cities in the world. And certainly from what I witnessed, it was unbelievably rapid development. So they were building a whole subway system, brand new subway system. They're putting in like 13 lines in like just a matter of, I don't know, 5-10 years, just crazy fast. So anyway, and so what really struck me is that I know how much people earn. The average Chinese farmer earns, which is 861 Canadian per year, the equivalent. And so to see Lamborghini dealerships and imagine farmers in the same country who average $861 a year, I think we forget this, that China is a developing country, and we think of all the Lamborghini stuff, all the wealth stuff. We don't think about China still has a large proportion of its population that are still pretty rural. So, now I think the prediction or the latest stats I've heard is that China maybe has about half its population urbanized. So that means the other half is still in rural areas. So they're getting those low wages. This is what I think the world forgets about China. So since I hadn't been to a rural area in that first 3 months, it took quite a while actually before, probably a few years before I could really get into some, fairly poor rural communities. I would see evidence of these people that I assumed had come to the city from a farming area, maybe fairly recently, and so you can see this man pulling a cart along. So you see this kind of thing still in China. You did then in Nanjing, and at the same time, Lamborghinis that people are driving. So huge extremes in a communist country. And so I've got some, I'll just read what I've written here, just extremes. While I keep going on about the wealth, I often forget China's still a developing country. Some stats: income averages 861 per year in rural areas and 3,153 in cities. So there's quite a big difference between the cities, which tend to be in the east. Really, it's the east is where the development is in China, not the west, like the major development. And so there's a big difference in the wealth and so what people have access to. So I was always puzzling about the extremes that I witnessed, and I was always, thinking about it and trying to develop an explanation. And so finally here I've got on March 10th, I think I've figured it out, at least in Nanjing. So I said, so just to read it, I figured it out. China is developing so fast, likely faster than any civilization in history, that its agrarian culture is clashing with globalization, and people are struggling at adapting. It's the only way I can explain what happened to me. While the Deji Plaza has Lamborghini and Rolls-Royce dealerships, my theory is that many Chinese who at least go to the upscale Western supermarket there are still in the midst of transitioning from their rural village. That's why I saw so many Chinese people trying to make sense of coffee. So I'll get into that story next slide. Okay, here's my story. This occurred March 10th, 2013, so 8 years ago in Nanjing. So I'm just talking about going up to a Western-style grocery store in this high-end shopping plaza in the middle of Nanjing, and that was called Deji Plaza. So, reading it. I walked up, and as I got my package of beans, it was like I had entered a small, isolated village, because suddenly everyone was watching. So I walked into the store to get some coffee beans, and there was a small group of people, and once I went to the coffee section, suddenly everyone was watching me. An old male customer with his wife motioned to the grinder girl that she needed to look after me. So he's making a motion to someone who works there to take care of me. Then a store manager type wanted to confirm that I knew they were coffee beans before telling the grinder girl to grind them up for me. So now I have two people in the store helping me with coffee. I'm just buying coffee, and it's in bean form, all these different bags. And I've got a group of people watching me. Then he asked if I would like a small sample of good American coffee so that he could show that he knew how to operate the espresso machine. So I got a distinct sense he was well aware of the, there was maybe 10, 15 people all watching, all eyes on me and him and how they interacted with me. And so, no one basically knew English. He did say good American coffee. That's all he knew. And so he was well aware they were watching, and I got a distinct sense he wanted to show off that he could satisfy this foreigner, right? Like it was considered like really to be international and to be aware of how to be international, like have an understanding of the outside world, was highly valued then. Like people would really honor, say a Chinese person who would know, how to deal with a foreigner, for instance. So there's this whole kind of feeling that I learned by that point after 3 months in China. So continuing on, after telling him it was good while people were watching, with visible pride, he thanked me. So he was just, his chest filled up and everything because I tasted this coffee. He made it up. He had ground it, put it in the espresso machine, made a cup of coffee. I sipped it, and I told him it was good, and I knew it was all on show for these people, so I kind of went along with it, and so he was just thrilled. You'd see a big smile on his face, and everyone looking at him admiringly that he knew how to make coffee for this foreigner. So, continuing on, by now a small crowd had formed to watch the grinder in action, while the now 3 employees made a fuss of me. Then the store manager type wanted to show off that he knew how to grind coffee. He pushed aside the sales girl, who was doing a fine job up to then, so that he could demonstrate this to me. Then the sales girl wrapped it up and handed it to me as the small crowd looked on, before smiling and nodding goodbye to me. So anyway, I think what happened, the store manager made this coffee for me. That's right, I sort of mixed it up a little. I guess it was already ground up. And, I had said, oh, good job, sort of thing, or it's good. And, he was filled with pride, and I guess that just made him want to go even further. So he wanted to show that he could grind the coffee. So he snatched it away from this girl who was already doing it for me to show that he could do that too. And so this is all my interpretation, of course, but I think I'm pretty right. Body language and so on, you can learn a lot. So anyway, so I go nodding goodbye. So I'm walking away and I feel like I'm leaving the little village that was surrounding me and watching me get coffee. So all this just to get a fresh, perked coffee. Another experience as a Westerner in the hamlet of 8 million people they call Nanjing. So I joke about it calling it a hamlet because this is the way people acted towards me. Like I was like something very unique, a foreigner, a white person. People wanted their photographs with me, like young girls and so on, teenagers would be all thrilled and they'd always call you handsome. They basically think all foreigners are handsome. And I think it's partly white skin and so on. So anyway, I was just treated like it was something really unique. And this is a city of 8 million, which to me is just like unbelievable. How can you not be exposed to foreigners? But part of my context is that Toronto, where I was born and raised, is the most multicultural city in the world. So this is just the opposite of Toronto. Just how people reacted to someone who looks different, like a different culture. Like this is what made it so fascinating for me. Unbelievable. It's so rich to go back and forth between this homogeneous culture in Nanjing and the heterogeneous, highly diverse culture in Toronto. So it was just so fascinating. And so how people would greet me is years later, I realized this isn't just Nanjing, it's actually all of China. So people would welcome me to China, almost like they were meeting me for the first time and I was entering their village. That's what it felt like to me, that I had just walked up to this village and talking to someone, and I tell them that I've been in China. It didn't matter how long, whether it'd been 5 years or whatnot. They would say, "Welcome to China." So it felt like I was just entering this little village and they were greeting me and opening their arms to me and saying, "Welcome." I heard that all the time. They were welcoming me to China. And it didn't matter if I said I'd been there 5 years or 7 years or whatever. They always did this. It didn't matter where I was in China. This is like China is 1.4 billion people in a little village. That's what it felt like, so, and where, and I'm the outsider, the foreigner. So yeah, just a very different experience. So I want to elaborate on this idea of heterogeneity, which is the percentage of people of a total population born in a foreign country. So this article came from China Daily, the English language daily in China, and it was on the front page of the newspaper. And it lists the top four cities in the world with the highest percentage of foreign-born residents. So Dubai came out as number one with 83% of its population born out in a foreign country. Brussels, second at 62%. Toronto, my hometown, at 46%. And Sydney, Australia, 39% of its population born in foreign countries. So that gives you a sense of the top ones in the world. And the article also went on to talk about comparing it to China and listing Beijing as the most diverse, culturally diverse city in China. And it's only at 0.5% of its population born in a foreign country. So you can imagine your chances in China, growing up in China, of coming across a foreigner are pretty slim. I mean, Beijing is the most diverse. In a place like Nanjing, it's even lower. And so your chances are very limited. And then I think of, I went to school, grew up in the Toronto area. I went to school with people from different countries. So did my son. And actually in my son's class, most of the other children were born in another country. So this is normal in Toronto. And then if there's any kind of political event around the world, you see it on the street in demonstrations. You cannot ignore the outside world in Toronto. But imagine growing up in China. Your chances of coming across a foreigner are limited. Your chances of going to school with one are probably even more limited. And you're never going to see, even if the country allowed it, you're never going to see demonstrations, of course. So how are you going to learn about foreign countries? How are you going to learn about different religions, different cultures? You're not. And so this is highly constraining to China. It's becoming a global force. So this other article, this other information is not surprising, which was also drawn from China Daily. So this is all about how many Chinese CEOs exist of global corporations. They go through the percentage of CEOs and what country they come from. Of course, lots are American, lots are British, and different European, French, and whatnot. And but they also list ones from developing countries. So they list some that are from Brazil, some CEOs that are also from India, but there isn't a single one listed of a Chinese CEO of a global corporation. And so the whole article is like, why is this? So it's asking that question. And basically what it comes up with is three things, which really start with poor English, by the poor English level of Chinese CEOs, or potential Chinese CEOs, as well as their limited understanding. So the combination of not knowing English and having a limited understanding of the outside world causes them to be reluctant to step out into the outside world and get the experience required to become a CEO of a global corporation. So they have very limited experience. They don't want to leave China. So highly constraining. So we can't be surprised when we look at this ranking by passportindex.org for this year, and this has been consistent. I've followed it for probably the last 8 years, and China is always well down the list. So it's got the second highest GDP in the world, but the power of its passport is more than halfway down the list of all the countries in the world. And power of a passport is just the measure of the power of that passport to get you into other countries without a visa. So Germany comes out on top, tied with Finland for first place with a score of 133. China is tied with little Cuba, and it's ranked at 53rd place with a score of 60. And Afghanistan, to give you an idea, is actually the very bottom, 78th place with a score of 30. So all the other countries are either ranked in between, are basically ranked in between those first and 53rd and 53rd and 78th. But China is well down the list. It does not at all reflect its power, its economic power in the world. And so this basically makes you more isolated if you're Chinese. you're going to have to get more visas to visit other countries compared to someone from Germany whose passport is far more powerful and is going to get you into far more countries without requiring a visa. Okay, we've come to the end of the third First Impressions of China video. And I just want to summarize the key points in this video. I think it all starts with, to understand China, is homogeneity and sort of the lack of mixing with the people from other countries. So first, that homogeneity is going to be greatest in Western China. So that's where the large rural area mainly is, all in the west. So think of more west and east. Eastern China is far more developed, so it's still going to be very homogeneous, but if there's any foreign teachers in China, the chances are very great that they're going to be in Eastern China. So if there's a chance to meet a foreigner, you've got to be in the East. If you're in the West, I think it's virtually impossible. It would be very unusual for a foreigner to be teaching way out in the West. So it's really in the East is if you're going to have a chance at all as a Chinese person to come across a foreigner and to get a foreign teacher. Definitely a foreign teacher. And I can confirm this. When I was teaching at my university in Nanjing, I had, some people I on the weekends, sometimes I would take students out, first year students, just for like an English class, informal English class. And some girls would be practically crying because I was the first foreigner they'd ever met. They'd never met one before. And this was very common. And so they were kind of overwhelmed. It's like they've seen movies and everything. So they're very interested in the West, but they actually haven't met someone. So they'd be overwhelmed with this. So just think, growing up in China, your chances of attending school with someone from another country are very limited, rare. And so going on to that article about CEOs, basically what happens, you don't have much interaction, so you don't develop much knowledge of the outside world, and so that makes the outside world kind of intimidating. And so you don't sort of dream of going to the outside world. This would be traditionally, although I think this is changing. I think younger people are very fascinated with the outside world. So back to the CEOs, older men, they would not have been that interested in the outside world. They'd probably be a little intimidated. So then it's, why should I learn English? I just want to stay in China. But of course, this limits their chances of getting the experience at the global level to be appointed as a CEO of a global corporation. And so there's just very limited experience there amongst senior Chinese business people. And so this is how it plays out. And so this affects students when they go to the West. They're all excited, the students that I was preparing to go to Western universities. They've watched TV, they've seen movies, they're excited to go there. They do want to interact with people from the host culture. They really want to embrace it, but it's also a little intimidating and scary. And so there's also that aspect of it. They're not used to it, like different. They've never met a foreigner typically, or hardly ever. So they don't have a good sense of how to talk with them. And so through my teaching in human geography, I was teaching them about that outside world. They were incredibly interested in it, no question. And some of them would even say that it really helped them, say, in a competition they entered, an international competition, made them feel more comfortable when they understood different religions, for instance. So if they met someone from the Middle East, they would think, okay, he's probably Muslim. I know a little bit about Islam from my class. And so that would give them a little more confidence. They wouldn't be so intimidated. And so it definitely helped them. But this is what it's like for them going to the West. They want to embrace it, but they go there, and there's certain things that are really different. And one thing I can say, universities are just completely wild in the West compared to China. China, they're very quiet. You don't see wild parties or anything like that. So just that as an example. They go to the Western university and there's these parties and people drinking. Well, young people don't drink that much in China. It's really the older men that do. So this is very alien to them. So they want to go to that party and meet people, but it's such a strange situation. And it's one that doesn't appeal to them. Actually, in Chinese culture, bars are considered pretty bad places. And so it's very difficult. So they want to, the young people, but it's challenging. I mean, you can imagine something that alien to you would be difficult to overcome. So anyway, this plays out with CEOs. It plays out, say, with passports. There isn't a lot of interaction considering the size of China. That passport should be near the top for sure. Second largest GDP in the world, and you're ranked down in the 50s with the power of your passport. You have to get visas for so many of the countries that you want to visit. That is going to discourage interaction. And so this, I think, is a major issue that is going to play out for years with China embracing the world. So different companies moving outside of China, they don't know much about the local culture at all. It's not like, it's bad enough, of course, in the West for a CEO to really sort of embrace African culture and think of, say Africans, I should be employing as many as the whites and so on. It's going to be even harder for a Chinese person who has virtually no experience with many foreigners. So anyway, just some reflections to try and develop this vision for humankind that we work together and try and prevent misunderstanding. So please leave any comments, whether positive or negative, at the end, or send to my email, because I'd really like to get some feedback about how it's going, and any ideas, any more things that I could talk